Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure once again to be on the platform of AMOG's High Risk. High Risk Committee AMOG's 2021 is jointly organizing this very informative webinar on hematological disorders in pregnancy in association with Nagpur OBGY Society and Ketkar Hospital. So I'll be starting then. There was a wonderful slide of Dharmendra saying that कुत्ते कमीने में तेरा खून पी जाऊंगा, and the slide was questioned like can we Indians afford this dialogue? So no way, we can't afford such dialogues of खून पी जाऊंगा, as anemia is so prevalent in our country. And our patients themselves, they define anemia as that, no, doctor साहब मेरे body में खून की बहुत कमी है. So they are so well versed with the situation, and we are having anemia everywhere. And when it comes to anemia with pregnancy itself is a very demanding situation, and anemia it worsens the things more. The definition of anemia, very simple: derangement of oxygen carrying capacity in our body. But as simple as the definition is, it is actually a complex entity to understand and treat, more so ever in a country like India with less resources, less knowledge, and less awareness. And anemia, the first step of series of changes in the body which push the pregnant lady more towards the morbid conditions. So it's a topic worth discussing, and we are really having experts with us for that today. But before going to the actual session, I now request Dr. Sadhna Patwardhan ma'am, Chairperson High Risk Committee, to address the gathering. I'll check with my technical issues till then. Over to you, Sadhna ma'am.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I welcome you all on behalf of as in the capacity of Chairperson High Risk Pregnancy Committee of AMOGS, the Nagpur OBGY Society, and Dr. Ketkar Hospital. As Shivangi rightly said, we are going to discuss two important issues. First is anemia in pregnancy, and second is thrombocytopenia of pregnancy. And we have two eminent stalwarts in this field. We are going to have a wonderful academic session. And not only that, Dr. Gorak has prepared a wonderful bulletin on anemia in pregnancy. We are going to release that eventually. Without taking much of your time, I request the chairpersons to take over and start the session. Thank you.
I request Dr. Vaidehi Marathi, President NOGS, to say a few words. Vaidehi ma'am?
Yeah, unmute karat hote, yeah. All right, so very good afternoon, everyone. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Respected guests of honor of the day, AMOGS President Dr. Nandita ma'am, who will be joining us very soon. Vice President AMOGS Dr. Pardesi sir. Chairpersons for the day, first Joint Secretary AMOGS Dr. Sujata Davi ma'am. Second Vice President of AMOGS Dr. Kiran Kurtakoti. Today's faculty, Dr. Gorak Mandrupkar and Dr. Abhay Bhave, respected seniors, dear friends, boys and girls. I'm immensely pleased to welcome you all to the VR World Digiogan, the unique digital space where we present a weekly academic as well as non-academic extravaganza. Today, we feel honored to be associated with AMOG's High Risk Committee and Dr. Ketkar Hospital for this very prestigious CME. Hematological disorders, although common, are often challenging for the clinicians. But today, we have an excellent faculty who has tremendous experience in this field. Their guidance will help us make this bumpy problem into a smooth ride. Here, I also wish to congratulate Dr. Mandrupkar for the e-bulletin on anemia, and I'm sure this will be immensely useful for all of us. So, friends, without much ado, I welcome all of you once again. Enjoy the learning on this beautiful, action-packed virtual learning platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vaidehi ma'am. May I now request my friend Dr. Sumit Bhayati, member of High Risk Committee AMOGS, to introduce our first chairperson and take the session forward. Sumit, are you there?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Shivangi. Good evening, everyone. It is my proud privilege to introduce Dr. Sujata Dalvi, chairperson, for this important update on the hematological disorders in pregnancy. Dr. Sujata Dalvi, ma'am, is a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist at Mumbai, attached to Global Saifi Bhatia St. Elizabeth and Jain Group of Hospitals, Mumbai. She is an honorary clinical associate at Nauroji Wadia Maternity and Jagjivan Ram Railway Hospital. She's the assistant editor of JOGI, that is the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology of India, member of Managing Council of Mumbai Obstetrics and Gynecological Society for last 15 years. She is the first joint secretary AMOGS at present. I welcome you, ma'am, and I request you to start the most awaited session. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Sumit,
You're welcome, ma'am.
kind introduction. At an outset, I would like to express my gratitude first to NOGS President Dr. Vaidehi, convener of today's program Dr. Sadhana Patwardhan. She is also an AMOGS High Risk Pregnancy Committee Chairperson. I would also like to express my gratitude to Dr. Mangala Ketkar of Hospital and also to President AMOGS Dr. Nandita Palshetkar and Vice President Dr. Rajendra Singh Pardesi for giving me this opportunity to be a chairperson in this session, which is a very important webinar on hematological disorders of pregnancy. It's my proud privilege to introduce a very dynamic person from Islampur, Dr. Gorakh Mandrupkar, who would be speaking on anemia in pregnancy. Dr. Gorakh is currently the Secretary of Gestosis India Association. He is a director of MCHS, which is a Center for Health Skill. He was a faculty for Symbiosis International University, Pune. He is a national joint secretary. He was a national joint secretary of FOXI in 2014 and 15. He was a chairperson of Medical Disorders of Pregnancy Committee of FOXI in 2015 and 18. He is a member of Task Force National Policy on PPH and Government of India. He is drafted FOXI GCPR 2019 guidelines on hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, and he is the one who has developed a gestosis score, which is based mainly on proper history taking of a patient who may develop PIH later on during pregnancy. He has got many books to his credit, many publications, and of course, innumerable lectures to his credit. So let us hear Dr. Gorakh Mandrupkar on anemia in pregnancy. Over to Dr. Gorakh.
Thank you very much. At the outset, I thank Dr. Sadhana Patwardhan Madam because without whose inspiration this webinar and this booklet was not possible. And actually, High Risk Pregnancy Committee of the AMOGS took initiative, and the discussions were going on the WhatsApp group, and later on, all the material was collected, and I was given opportunity to draft it, and we have made it very simple. Soon it will be released, and I'm going to talk on the subject of anemia in pregnancy, especially the nutritional anemia and the management of iron deficiency anemia. As Vaidehi Madam has already said, it is a very vast topic and it is very difficult to cover in 20 or 30 minutes. But here we are going to focus mainly on the diagnostic aspect, the simple aspect, that is the ABC of CBC of the anemia, and then how to treat and how to make it very simple without making much complexities in the management of iron deficiency anemia. So I will now share my screen. Am I visible?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So, in spite of, I will say, our best efforts and Indian government's generous interventions, anemia still holds its tight on Indian population because the incidence of anemia we just calculated in a small group of doctors, and even there also we found the incidence of anemia was almost 25 to 30%. This was a month back. So it is in line with concentrated efforts by Government of India and FOXI, AMOGS. We need to contribute our bit in making India anemia free. And I think this webinar by High Risk Pregnancy Committee and intention of Dr. Sadhana Madam is mainly towards this Shapath or a path to anemia Mukt Bharat, which is a dream of our own Prime Minister Narendra Ji Modi. We know that anemia adds fuels to pregnancy complication irrespective of the cause. It has been linked with adverse maternal and neonatal outcomes, right from general fatigue palpitation to preterm delivery, APH, postpartum hemorrhage, prolonged labor, sepsis, low birth weight, increased risk of infection, and many things. They are being actually related to this as a complication of anemia, prematurity, respiratory distress syndrome, and even as what Madam was mentioning about the Justosi score. In that also, we have found the risk of anemia as a provocating factor even for hypertensive disorder, and we have included as one of the mild risk factor in the Justosi score. Now, how the screening should be done? All pregnant women, they must be screened. Initially, we used to call with hemoglobin, but now we should not, and we always should call it as with complete blood count at first visit. And the CBC is to be repeated in each trimester. Because apart from hemoglobin, other blood indices, they help us to diagnose the type of anemia, grading of anemia, and based on especially the MCV value, that is the mean corpuscular volume, which the evaluation can be started and management can be prompted immediately. So let us go to the subject of ABC of CBC. So just with the report of complete blood count in our hand, we can diagnose the anemia almost in 90 to 95% of the cases. I think respected Dr. Bhave is here, and he definitely is authority in a subject, and he will also agree to this, that yes, a clear one good CBC report, a clear one a simple smear report, that will give the diagnosis of anemia not only but the type of anemia as well. Iron studies. So whenever the mean corpuscular volume is less than 80, that means this is a microcytic anemia, and in that case, what can be done? So despite doing so many things, serum ferritin is highly specific for iron deficiency anemia. The blood for iron studies. Again, many says that serum iron, then the TIBC, ferritin, everything should be done. But yes, it is mainly the ferritin which is very sensitive. And if the ferritin is more than 30, then straight away, um, more than 30, then the diagnosis is this is not a case of iron deficiency. But when the ferritin is 30 or less than that, this is a clear case of iron deficiency anemia, and we can start the treatment. So just after seeing the microcytic anemia, if we are suspecting iron deficiency anemia, it is the serum ferritin that will lead us to the diagnosis. But if that is a case of microcytic anemia with ferritin normal or more than 30, then probably this is not a case of, or almost we can say this is not a case of iron deficiency, and straight away HPLC, that is the high performance liquid chromatography, to be done, because this might be the case of thalassemia or any other things. Other tests which are recommended depending upon again area, my area, the Western Maharashtra is a hub, that is Sangli district, Kolhapur district and all, hub of the hookworm infestations. So because a lot of farmers are there, and again still all the buffaloes and etc., they are there in the backyard of the houses. So yes, the hookworm infestation is very common. So during the micro stool for the hookworm are to be examined. Even the discussion was going on that chronic urinary tract infections, they are associated with iron deficiency anemia. So the LFTs, urine routine micro and stool for hookworm are the other investigations which we are supposed to be done. A word about HPLC. Why I'm telling HPLC and routine chromatography or routine HB electrophoresis, why I have not mentioned. Again, the reason is when we see the cost of the therapy, it is almost the same. But the diagnosis what we get from the HPLC is very great. It is sensitive, fast, automated test to study the HB variants, and it identifies and gives the quantification of normal and hemoglobins in a single test. So again, repeating the tests, doing the battery of investigations, already the patient is already she is in agony and we are doing again much investigations, cost, etc. It is not involved. So it is always better that to perform HPLC in cases where the iron deficiency anemia is not suspected. Now when MCV is more than 80, so that means that is a case of macrocytic anemia. Again, the simple diagnosis which will come to our mind is usually it is the vitamin B12 deficiency or folic acid deficiency in almost more than 90% of the cases. But in certain cases of bleeding or hemolysis, definitely MCV we find more and still the patient is having anemic. Again, the reticulocyte index, where somewhere it is written as RI, it is RPI, that is to be done. If it is less than 2%, definitely there is a decreased production of reticulocytes. So again, maturity problems, vitamin B12 and folic acid deficiency. When RI is more than 3%, usually it is because of loss of red blood cells and the causes like bleeding or hemolysis, obviously, likewise, history also will be there. And when we find that on CBC, the WSA counts are too low, platelets are too low, then yes, the bone marrow aspiration that will confirm the diagnosis of aplastic anemia. But these all otherwise diagnoses we have to keep in mind. We have to keep in a differential diagnosis and with simple things, definitely they will lead us. The third variety is MCV is normal. So normocytic anemia. Again, here the reticulocyte index that will help us. If it is more than 3%, usually it is the loss of red blood cells from bleeding or hemolysis. But normal RI, yes, that can be there in early iron deficiency anemia with less than 15% of the transferrin saturation. So definitely, though I am stressing that serum ferritin is the sensitive marker, along with that, if other studies are done, definitely they may lead us to the correct diagnosis like sideroblastic anemia or early iron deficiency anemia, along with a proper IDA. When there is a mixed picture, that microcytic hypochromic along with normo or macrocytic normochromic cells, that means usually this is a picture of dimorphic anemia. So here again, the peripheral smear exam is important to diagnose it. I am stressing again and again, keeping our India and all the peripheral doctors in front of mind, the basic investigations which are to be done to type the anemia. The RDW, that is the red cell distribution width, is increased very much. Again, the possible combinations are there can be folic acid along with iron deficiency. Another combination can be the B12 and iron deficiency, like pernicious anemia with gastroatrophic gastritis and iron deficiency anemia. Thalassemia minor and B12 or folic acid deficiency. So like combinations are also common in our India. So though, yes, there are certain belts which are known as thalassemic belts, there are certain belts which are sickle belts, and there are certain belts like us, where again vitamin B12 deficiency is very common. In our area, we have found that yes, vitamin B12 deficiency is very common. Again, iron deficiency and hemolysis, we have to keep in mind that diagnosis is like prosthetic valve and all. Likewise, diagnosis, combinations, we have keep in our mind when we are dealing with dimorphic anemia. So this is a chart what we have prepared, and I'm just winding up with this chart and then we'll go to the management part. So that whenever hemoglobin is less than 11, we have to see what is the MCV. If it is low MCV, that means microcytic anemia, we can concentrate on the RDW. If that RDW is high, actually, we can talk a lot on RDW because it has a very great significance. We can talk almost for 15-20 minutes, but this is not today's year. So I'm just mentioning it that high RDW and low RDW are normal. So when it is high, usually we have to suspect the iron deficiency anemia. Iron ferritin transferrin GIBC done. Again, everybody is giving some different diagnosis. So when there is low iron and ferritin is less, percent transfer in saturation is less, but TIBC is high. It's a classic iron deficiency anemia. When iron is low, even ferritin is low or normal, but TIBC is low. So when TIBC is low, usually this is an anemia of chronic infection. Again, with normal TIBC, but high iron. The iron will be high, ferritin will be normal. Usually, that is a classic case of sideroblastic anemia. And when normal or high iron and ferritin is more than 30, but still there is low MCV, with even high RDW, we have to go for HPLC. But usually thalassaemic patients, they will have low or normal RDW, where we have to suspect the thalassemia, and straight away we have to go for HPLC. So this is actually a random chart, though we are not claiming that this is the standard way, but ideally, I think everybody will agree that if we jump in this way, definitely we can have an early diagnosis and we can initiate a treatment early, despite just when patient is of 9 hemoglobin, we are giving him her iron like anything. We are not suspecting or we have not diagnosed the thalassemia and we are just loading her with iron. It should not happen. Then the lower one is the second arm, that is high or normal MCV. Then yes, depending upon reticulocyte index, we can definitely go with the maturation defects like vitamin B12 folic acid deficiency, or then depending upon the further diagnosis, yes, we can have the correct diagnosis of anemia. So this is a schematic diagnosis of anemia which we have included in the small booklet which we are going to publish it now. Now coming to the management of iron deficiency anemia, it is my second part of the lecture. Again, I am going to be very precise because there are so many confusions or public health importance, or the books of the public health, they may give some ideas, hematological books, they may give some ideas, iron, the obstetric books, they may give some ideas, but we have to be very clear that we are dealing with a pregnant woman which has few months in our hand, and we should not allow her to go into the complications. So our management of anemia, iron deficiency anemia, should be enough aggressive, as well as it should be enough aggressive that it should not cause any harm to mother and baby, but it should not, the anemia should not cause harm to the mother and baby. That also we have to keep in mind. So there are three things: mild anemia, moderate anemia, and severe anemia. All the slides what I am talking, they are with good evidences. These are not my personal opinions. The recent Anemia Mukt Bharat guidelines 2018, as well as the Royal College guidelines. Again, I have gone through the WHO guidelines, I have gone through the FOXI guidelines, and WHO guidelines, and then these slides are prepared. So I'm very precise. Mild anemia, when hemoglobin is 10 to 10.9. So are we supposed to treat this anemia? Yes, we are supposed to treat this anemia. Here we have to keep a difference in our, and we are not talking of prophylactic iron tablets. We are talking of the management of anemia. So recommended dose in the treatment of iron deficiency varies from 60 to 200 milligram of oral elemental iron per day. WHO recommends daily 120 along with folic acid, but here I would like to stress the Government of India guidelines where they recommend 200 milligram of elemental iron plus 1000 microgram of folic acid. That means the 2 tablets of iron folic. That is a recommended dose in the management of mild anemia. Hemoglobin is to be repeated after 4 weeks of the oral iron, and we have to check whether the HB is raised. If HB is not raised at the end of 1 month of treatment, or if oral iron is not tolerated, then the IV iron sucrose or ferric carboxymaltose is used. Somebody may be worried whether he is going to say us about first trimester, second trimester or not. Yes, I'm going to come to that. Moderate anemia. When HB is 7 to 9.9, all the guidelines, they clear cut says that parenteral iron therapy is the ideal and recommended along with folate supplements. Here again somebody may say, अरे कुछ नहीं, हमारा oral iron खाने से the HB raises in 1 month to 2.5, 3 and some, so there is no. These are the guidelines, and if we follow them strictly, definitely the complications which are arising out of anemia in pregnancy will be minimized. Severe anemia, hemoglobin less than 7. Severe anemia, remote from term, can be managed with IV iron preparations. But if we are near term, blood transfusion is indicated in severe anemia with decompensation, with or without signs of cardiac failure and or hypoxia, or in failed IV iron therapy. So this is a very precise and perfect line. I will repeat again. Severe anemia, remote from term, can be managed with IV iron compensation, with or without signs of cardiac failure and or hypoxia or failed IV iron therapy. Again, definitely the critical care team, in association with critical care team, we have to handle such patients. Now last few slides. Oral iron preparations and facts. Commonly used iron preparations are ferrous sulfate, ascorbate, fumarate. Ferrous sulfate polymeric complex is the best tolerated oral preparation with good compliance. Ferrous ascorbate and calcium citrate can be tried when ferrous sulfate is not tolerated. But iron absorption, we have to keep in mind that it is retarded by phytates, tannin and antacids. Here just I will give one example, that whenever we eat pohe, right? The Marathi manus manje pohe. So whenever we eat pohe, we are told that we have to put a lemon on that. Limbu apan त्याच्यावरती we put on that. Why we do that? Again, because our ancestors, they know that when we put the lemon on that, definitely it increases the absorption of the iron, which because the pohas, they are one of the good sources of iron. So that means the iron tablets are usually, if taken along with lemon juice, they are better absorbed. So again, this is a very good thing. But again, what we are doing, we are drinking tea after the pohe. So chaha pohe is a usual combination. And what we are doing, the tannins in the tea, it is making a complex, and all the poha, the iron from poha goes away. So it should not happen. And these are the facts which we must know, and we should inform the patient that iron tablets are ideally taken before meal or at least 1 hour after meal. Food, tea or any type of antacid just before or after tablet will reduce the absorption. Usually it is a fashion that because the patient tells, I got acidity because of these your tablets, we prescribe the antacids. But that we have to keep in mind. If it is taken along with lemon juice, better absorbed. The GI side effects like diarrhea, constipation, abdominal pain and all, we all know, but we have to inform to the patient that yes, for a few days it may happen, kindly bear with us. If they do not subside within a week, please report us, we will change the formulation. But if they subside within a week, please continue with the tablet. Why ferrous ascorbate again? Because ferrous ascorbate preserves the absorbable ferrous state after entrance into alkaline duodenum, and ferrous ascorbate is more resistant to oxidation at alkaline pH. Mucosal uptake and mucosal transfer is better as compared to the other iron forms. And this study again in 2015 has definitely proven the fact that yes, ferrous ascorbate is one of the good tolerable iron preparation. Again, some are telling the peptonized iron. So does it help? Yes. Amino acids in peptone, they are known to enhance iron absorption by providing acidic environment in the first part of the intestine. The next part is parenteral iron preparation and facts. This is the last second part. Intramuscular iron preparations like iron sorbitol, iron dextran, and iron polymaltose. Just I have mentioned it, कि it should not happen, कि we have not mentioned the history.
No.
Hello.
No, me एक faculty.
Sadhana, can you mute? Yeah, okay, go ahead, Dr. Gorath.
Sorry, I'm sorry. So the intramuscular iron preparations like iron sorbitol, iron dextran, and iron polymaltose, due to fear of hypersensitivity and pain at injection site, intramuscular iron is, I will not say better, it is to be avoided. Very clear cut message I want to give here, that intramuscular iron preparations, they must not be used. Intravenous iron preparations, they are safe. They have proven the safety, like iron sucrose and ferric carboxymaltose. What are the prerequisites for the parenteral iron therapy? The diagnosis of iron deficiency must be confirmed before parenteral therapy. Health facility must have adequate supervision and facilities for the management of anaphylaxis. On one side, I am saying that there is no reported anaphylaxis to iron sucrose as well as FCM. But yes, we have to be always precautious. It has been seen that even the cetirizine has given the anaphylaxis. This is a fact. Vitamin B12 has shown to give the anaphylaxis. So we have to be ready for the things in our OPDs. So I am telling this thing. Oral iron should be stopped at least 24 hours prior to therapy to avoid the toxic reaction. What are the contraindications to the parenteral iron? So here comes the first trimester of the pregnancy. There we have to use the oral iron and the good diet chart. But IV or parenteral ions, they are absolutely not to be given in first trimester of pregnancy. History of anaphylactic reactions to parenteral iron therapy, chronic liver disease, and active infection, if any. How to calculate the dose? Very simple thing, not to keep a formula in our mind. Simple thing, 12 minus actual HB. That is the best option. So suppose my HB is 10, so 12 minus 10, 2 into the pre-pregnancy weight, that means weight at first visit, and into 2.4. That's it. Plus 1000 milligram for replenishment of the stores. And it is always better to calculate this full dose. Iron sucrose. These are the facts. It is safe with few adverse events. It is rapidly taken by bone marrow for erythropoiesis and reticuloendothelial system for storage. How to prepare the iron sucrose drip? The problem of iron sucrose is we cannot give more than 100 to 200 milligram at a time. 200 milligram fine. So schedule we have to make in a way that 200 milligram twice in a week till the total dose is achieved. We cannot give more than that iron sucrose. So suppose my patient's dose, total iron dose comes as 1.5 gram, then probably I have to give 200 milligram on Monday, on Thursday. So likewise, I have to give it till the total of the 1.5 gram is over. So that means whenever we are giving iron sucrose, it will be a long therapy. But yes, in many government setups, it is available free of cost. So yes, even if it is long, and if the condition is allowing us, we can use that. How to prepare the infusion drip? That is very important. 100 to 250 ml of the normal saline is taken, and in that 100 to 200 milligram of the iron sucrose, that means 1 or 2 ampules, they are diluted. Now once the solution is prepared, the drip rate is adjusted so that the total drip completes within 30 minutes. Not too slow, not too fast. That is a recommendation. If we use this way, there is no problem we are going to face. Next is FCM. It is found to be superior to all other parenteral iron preparation products because it is dextran free. So absolutely no reaction, absolutely no anaphylaxis. And the preparations, they allow the rapid administration even of the high dosages of the iron, and almost a total dose can be achieved. Almost. I'm not telling all, but almost. How to prepare the FCM drip? See, 200 to 500 milligram of the FCM, that means 4 to 10 ml, is diluted with 100 ml of the normal saline. Suppose we have decided that I want to give 200 to 500 milligram on day 1. Then 100 ml of the normal saline is taken, and in that we put 200 to 500 mg of FCM. It is to be given over 6 minutes. But we have decided, I want to give more than that, and up to 500 to 1000 I have to give. Then yes, it is diluted with 250 ml of normal saline, and it is to be given over 15 minutes. Those who want to take the picture of the slide, they can be taken, because this is very important. We have to see the dilution, and we have to see the diluent, and we have to see the trip rate as well. And schedule can be made to give not more than 1000 milligram in a week till total dose is achieved. So in my patient where the dose was 1.5 gram, so today I will give 1000, and again in next week on Tuesday I will give the rest of the 500 milligram. So likewise we have to adjust the dose, but this FCM definitely minimizes the visits, almost the total dose it goes. So where the patients, not the follow-ups are not possible from remote areas, it is a best better option, of course, from second trimester onwards. I think the last part of the lecture, adjuvant therapies. Deworming, yes. Administration of antihelminth agent is recommended as an additional intervention to reduce anemia. Single dose albendazole 400 milligram is given in second or third trimester. Because mebendazole is not available in many areas, even in many government setups, so albendazole has come up in the slides. Folic acid, most of the iron preparations, they contain 1 milligram of the folate, which is sufficient to meet the increased needs of pregnancy. A high dose of 5 milligram per day is recommended in multiple pregnancies, hemolytic disorders, or folate metabolism disorders, or family history of NTD, OHDM, and especially in patients with epilepsy, those who wear on valproate and carbamazepine. Vitamin B12, yes, daily 2.6 microgram of vitamin B12 is recommended, and to correct the deficiencies, in many cases, I have written in a rare, but yes, in many cases, it is given as an injectable form as well. Vitamin C, though it is mentioned that ascorbic acid improves the iron absorption, but routine vitamin C supplementation in iron deficiency anemia, it is not recommended. Protein, either in diet or powders, but whenever you are giving any protein powder, please, it is a sincere request to all of you, please go back protein powder ka dabba, and you will surprise, you will laugh that what we are giving to our patients is a lot of carbohydrates, because all our protein dabbas, maximum of our protein dabbas, they give lot of sugar to our patients and very less protein. So we have to be very careful while prescribing them. Role of folic acid and vitamin B12 we know for the maturation of RBCs. Yes, it is absolutely necessary for neuron growth as well. And in vitamin B12 deficiency is endemic in Indian population. Yes, here this study shows of North India. I am quoting of western part of the Maharashtra as well, that yes, it is very common. And why we give both together? That concept just we have to keep in mind is a folate trap. Folic acid traps the vitamin B12 for its own metabolism. And that's why whenever we are treating anemia, the best combination will be an iron tablet of ferrous ascorbate, especially if it is peptonized, great, containing 1 milligram of folic acid with at least more than 0.2 microgram of vitamin B12, and along with a good protein. Yes, this is the last part from the government recommendations, that in malaria, sickle cell disease, and fluorosis areas, endemic areas, there we have to be very careful that the anemia might be due to chronic malaria, Then in sickle cell belts, we have to be very careful for the diagnosis of anemia. And in fluorosis, again, yes, as per the government guidelines, the mass water testing, then marking sources with fluoride more than 1 ppm is recommended. And that also we have to keep in mind as a doctor. I have specifically given these further readings that these are the beautiful things what we should read. The Gopalan, the ICMR chart, WHO guidelines, then these Anemia Mukt Bharat guidelines. Last are the annexures, foods rich in iron, and then I will stop. We should know that heme sources and non-heme sources of the food. The heme sources are non-vegetarian food, which are highly absorbed. So those who can eat, who are non-vegetarians, then yes, the beef meal, I'm not recommending all these things, but whoever are eating, they can eat this. Egg, hen, liver, sheep, mutton, muscle, it gives a lot of iron. A very important thing I want to focus here, कि we say any anemic patient कि तू खजूर खा, beet खा, or likewise. But do we really know कि what has a good amount of iron? Actually, highest content is in haliv. हळीव, ऑल मराठी माणूस मस्ट नो हळीव, हलीम, राईट. किल्ल्यावरती आपण दिवाळीच्या वेळेला टाकतो बिकॉज इट गिव्स 100 milligram of iron of 100 gram of the 100 out of 100 halim. So this is that much richest source. The next richest source that is available is Amarnath polygonides, राजगिरा, राजगिऱ्याची भाजी, राजगिऱ्याचा लाडू, that is the richest source. I did one experiment. I am eating Rajgira Ladu for almost 1 year, daily 2 ladus, small ladus, and I have not taken any single tablet and all, and I have gone through my hemoglobin levels, and definitely they are the best one. And I have done thrice blood donation last year and twice since the lockdown. Roots and tubers, beetroot, yes, but it is less source, 1.19. So sitafal, better. Then dates dried, better. Cheese, cashew nuts, they are better iron sources. About the indication of blood transfusion, though I am not an authority in this, but I have just mentioned from the WHO that where the blood transfusion is to be given. So, coming to the end of talk, Anemia Mukt Bharat is one such nutrition awareness program to bring about behavior change in people towards healthy living, towards an Anemia Mukt Bharat. So it is my sincere request to all of you that whenever any patient, pregnant patient comes along with anemia, because I am a person who has worked a lot for medical disorders, so I always say that at first visit, anemia, hypertensive disorders, anemia by CBC, hypertensive disorders by Justosi score, GDM by GCT, and TSH for thyroid disorders, we have to see, because all these conditions are very common in our area. So I thank you very much for patient listening, and I again thank Dr. Nandita Palsitkar Madam, President AMOGS, Chairman Dr. Sadhana Patwardhan Madam, Dr. Pardeshi Sir, Dr. Dalvi Madam, and of course Dr. Kiran Kurtakoti and Nagpur team for patient listening. While talking, if I may have gone here and there, so probably if something has happened from me, please correct me. And thank you very much.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Gorakh. You didn't go here and there. You just showed us a straight road towards Anemia Mukt Bharat. I must tell you that. I just have to ask you two things. What exactly specific nutritional advice you give it to the patient on whom you have made a diagnosis of anemia? That's number one.
Okay.
And second thing, if it's a moderate anemia and you have given a parenteral iron, do you still give a oral iron as a maintenance dose? Do you
Okay.
or do you not?
Okay, I will just answer the second question first.
Yes.
That whenever we are giving the injectable iron, it is recommended that we have to stop the oral iron. Actually,
That
especially
you said 24 hours prior, but
Prior.
later on, because sometimes the hemoglobin doesn't rise to the extent that we would want to it to be.
Right.
So do you wait for the hemoglobin to rise after about 2 to 3 weeks, and then if it has not risen to your expectation, then you start off with oral, or what do you do?
Right. Whenever we are giving any parenteral iron, we have to wait for 21 days at least, and then only hemoglobin raises. Even
Correct.
when we are using the oral iron, there also we wait for 1 month. So here we have to wait for 3 weeks. And if it is not rising, probably our diagnosis has gone wrong. And this is not a case of iron deficiency anemia, because despite giving parenteral iron, the hemoglobin has not raised much. So probably we have to check our diagnosis.
Suppose if
About
it
the-
has risen to some extent, say from moderate it has gone to mild, then do you put her on oral after 3 weeks? I would just want to know. You've given a
After 3 weeks,
parenteral. After
after
3
three,
weeks.
yes,
Yes.
after 3 weeks, yes, definitely, but it will be as a prophylactic dose of
Or
pregnancy.
as a maintenance, you can put it that way. Yes. And what extra nutritional advice? Because
Yes.
just giving iron is not enough. You need to
Correct.
tell them something about nutrition. Otherwise, they go back to wherever they were after a few months or whatever it is. So I
Right.
just wanted
So,
to know a little bit.
yes, in my clinic, but definitely there is a, we tell them ki तुम्ही आधी काय खाता, what do you eat?
That's
So we
right.
first understand ki what are their food habits, and in that we tell them ki what to do. Say for example, many pregnant ladies, they are eating some laddus. So we tell them that you put halib in that. So that is number one. Second, halivची खीर आम्ही खायला सांगतो. So every Saturday and Sunday they have to drink a glass full of halivची खीर of halim, right? That gives a lot of good thing. Second thing, my all pregnant women, they are eating 2 Rajgira laddu, right? And that doesn't increase a lot of sugar, because again it contains the black good,
Jaggery,
right?
yes.
Black jaggery.
Correct.
So this is the
That
specific
also has
advice.
iron. Yes.
Yes. And again, we tell them about the hand washing techniques and all. Then usually I give them the we tell them to you wear the socks for the heels and all, because many they come with the heel breakings, and that there is a main cause in our area, that is the hookworm infestation. So accordingly we have to give the advice. So likewise we tell them, and definitely it has shown it has improved the hemoglobin levels.
Okay.
Thank you so
Now-
much. I can see Dr. Nandita. She's just
Yeah.
joined in.
Doctor-
Welcome.
We have an important announcement and activity.
Yes.
Shivangi.
Please go ahead. Go ahead. Yes. I'm
Yes,
done.
yes. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Gorakh sir, for such a lucid presentation. And thank you, Sujata ma'am, for carrying the session so well. We welcome Dr. Nandita Palshetkar ma'am, President AMOGS. We were waiting for you, ma'am. Yeah. Yes, welcome. And we officially welcome Dr. Rajendra Singh Pardesi sir. We had a chit chat with him at the outset only, but then welcome ma'am and sir. In the midway, I just want to make an announcement. We can take the question and answers at the end of the session, maybe. And midway here, we take this opportunity to launch an e-bulletin on anemia in pregnancy, which is the systematic e-compilation of the real practice experiences of the AMOGS high-risk committee members. And the hard work of compilation is done by none other than Dr. Gorakh Mandrukar sir. I really acknowledge his sincere efforts for motivating us and taking out this very good compilation of good facts to share with all. I request
Yeah,
Dr. Nandita Palshetkar ma'am, Dr. Pardesi sir, and Dr. Abhay Bhave sir, and all others to join in the launch of this.
Yeah, include the chairperson also, Dr. Kiran Kothapur.
Yeah, Dr. Kiran sir and Dr. Sujata Dalvi
Dr.
ma'am.
Sadhana Patwardhan. And Gorakh.
Yes,
Yeah,
Gorakh,
with
where are
the
you?
Sujata
Sujata is
ma'am
our
show.
office bearer. Sujata is also the office bearer.
Yeah,
So
come
I
on, all
think
of
everybody should be
Where's
included.
Kiran sir? I can't see him on the screen. Where
Kiran
is
was
he?
there just now. I saw.
I'm there.
Yes,
I'm
Kiran
there.
is there.
See him
Kiran
on
is
the
there.
screen, yeah.
So
Yes,
because
Kiran is there.
she's put this up, so we can't do a gallery view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think.
So Nilima,
Is Neelam ready?
Neelam, are you there?
एक minute, Dada.
It's a series of wonderful facts. He has done a lot of hard work. We are in a virtual meet. Otherwise, बहुत जोरों से तालियां पड़ती थी गोरख सर.
But Gorakh is an amazing human being. You know, he's very hardworking and very, very sincere. So I think.
And
sure.
who was that?
You know, Sadhana, it's amazing that he could speak on anemia and pregnancy in front of Abhay Bhave, my friend, who's an expert. So I think Abhay, I have to give Gorak full marks for guts. Yeah.
It was very good.
Thank you for being here, Abhay. We are very happy to have you here. And Gorak, first of all, on behalf of AMOGS, I'm really, really proud to, launch this bulletin.
I think we give him a big hand.
I think I want to congratulate first Sadhana. Sadhana, as the chairman of the Medical Disorders Committee, you've taken this initiative and you have, encouraged Gorak to do this. And Gorak, as I said before, it's a phenomenal work, lot of hard work put into it. And I must sincerely thank you for this work. Because and we want MCure, I think Abhijit is there and all the others from MCure. We want you all to reach this to each and every gynecologist in this country. So the hard work which Gorak and the team has put in will actually, see fruition. It'll make an impact. It'll make a difference. I think this is a problem which everybody really needs to know. And I'm so happy to see Dr. Pardesi. He is an amazing person. He silently works behind the scenes and, takes it. And I am giving it in writing. Please write it down that AMOGS under his presidency after mine is going to reach even more heights. I mean, the way he is working with me without any, he works as if it's his own. So a person who works for an organization without thinking of the post will definitely take it to a fantastic level. And I think Kiran is waiting in the wings. He's watching all of us and enjoying it. And Kiran, I'm really looking forward. I shall be the grand old lady by the time you come in. Okay? But I shall, don't forget me. Okay, Kiran?
No. You are ever young in our hearts. Yeah.
You have to call me, but I think I want to really tell the AMOGS audience which is here that this organization committee of AMOGS which is there, we all love you so much and it's a fantastic team which is there together. And Sujata has been our treasurer and she had done fantastic work last year. Now she's the joint secretary, clinical joint secretary at the moment, and really looking forward to seeing her as a secretary. And of course, the Nagpur team is here, Rajasi and Vaidehi. I think the less said about them, the better, because they are absolutely done a wonderful, wonderful job. And I'm so happy that AMOGS has these heras, I call them heras in our basket, which are shining and doing fantastic work. Kalpana, thank you for being here. And Shivangi, good job at comparing the show. And the bulletin is fantastic. Gorak, I cannot really tell you how much I appreciate this work that you've done. And so simply put, I listened to your talk also, and it was really nice and very lucid, as Shivangi said, amazing. And Sadhana, thank you. I know you were busy initially. She's only started doing programs now, but she's become like a, in Maharashtra we say Deccan Queen. Deccan Queen Sakit Palti and Usti itke programs karte hain. And Abhay, I've been only talking to you on the phone, so it's nice to see you in person. And Abhay is always one of our favorite speakers, and he is such a fantastic speaker. I think you belong to the AMOGS family. We should give you an honorary membership of AMOGS. Thank you, MCure. Thank you.
Yes, madam. We should give.
Pardon? Kon kai bolla ka?
Thank you Nandita ma'am for that wonderful message. Nandita ma'am, जब आप बात करते हो तो ऐसा लगता है सुनते ही जाओ. आणि I'm not exaggerating anything. Everybody is saying yes in this virtual column. Yeah, but then we have to move on. Next on the series, we have thrombocytopenia in pregnancy, which is a real challenging situation for an obstetrician and definitely needs a teamwork along with the hematologist and physicians as well. I now request Dr. Kalpana Gulwade ma'am, member of High-Risk Committee AMOGS, to welcome our next chairperson, an eminent person, Dr. Kiran sir, and hand over the session to him. Over to you, Kalpana ma'am.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. Good evening to everybody, and I thank the Deccan Queen, Sadhana Patwardhan madam, for including me, and I pay my respects to all the seniors members. I'm here to introduce Dr. Kiran Kuratkoti, who actually requires no introduction. Sir is the second vice president of AMOGS, and he's been the chairperson of the MTP committee in AMOGS and the Medical Education Research and Training. In FOXI, he has been the prestigious MTP committee and has been the organizing chairman of the hugely successful FOXI AMOGS POGS conference. We also realize that he has been the recipient of Best Paper Awards in Endoscopy at AICOG Bangalore and Chennai. So a person of about 150 talks at national and international conferences, I present to you Dr. Kiran Kuratkoti, sir. The stage is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. At the outset, thank you, Nagpur Society. Thank you, Dr. Patwardhan, for considering me for this particular post and position. Thank you so much. Is Dr. Pardeshi sir there? Is Dr. Pardeshi sir still there with us?
Yes.
Yeah. At this point of time, I would request Dr. Pardeshi sir also to say a few words.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kiran. I think this is a very nice informative webinar, and Dr. Nandita highlighted it. Basic hematological disorder to deal with this anemia and thrombocytopenia. Thrombocytopenia is now remaining, and which is life-threatening if neglected. I think now you will be introducing and inviting Dr. Abhay Bhave. It's a nice webinar. Dr. Vaidehi and all other team, Dr. Sadhana Gupta, really doing nice work. And Vaidehi we are telling all others, Vaidehi Marathi, not Marathi. I can't speak Marathi. She's Vaidehi marathon. The way she is working at Vaidehi marathon. So my sincere wishes to the webinar. Thank you so much. Continue. Over to Kiran.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, if Dr. Sadhana Patwardhan is the Deccan Queen, I think Vaidehi should be called as the Rajdhani of India, probably, because of so many Digio Gyans that she has filled out to all of us. Thank you. Thank you, Pardeshi sir. It's a privilege for me to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Abhay Bhave from Mumbai. Dr. Abhay has got the Fellowship of Hematology of the CMC Vellore. He has Fellowship in Hematology of the Royal College of Australasia. He is the member of the ICMR Task Force on National Guidelines for Myelodysplastic Syndrome. He is member of the Newer Anticoagulants Guidelines. He is member of the Guidelines of the Pulmonary Embolism. He is the chief editor of Lilavati Hospital Medical Times. He is the guest editor of Maharashtra IMA on Practical Hematology. He is the council member for the Marrow Donor Registry of India, chairperson of the Lions Club Mumbai. He is the recipient of the B.R. Balasubramaniam Award from the Indian Medical Association. He is the recipient of the Ekta Manch Award for Community Service in 2007. And he has got to his credit several national and international publications. And it's a privilege for me to invite Dr. Abhay Bhave on the AMOGS platform and present his talk on thrombocytopenia in pregnancy. Dr. Abhay Bhave, the stage is yours. Dr. Bhave.
Thank you, Dr. Kiran. It's really a pleasure. Thank you for the words of introduction. I'll say thank you and a big hello to Dr. Nandita Palshetkar, Dr. Pardeshi, Dr. Patwardhan, Dr. Sujata Dalvi, I think Dr. Ketkar, I can't see her, but Dr. Mangala Ketkar, Dr. Sen Gupta, and of course, Dr. Shivangi for being such a good MC. Can't forget to say hello to Dr. Gorak. What a fabulous amount of effort, work you've put in, really amazing. I wish you could convert it into an app. It might be great to convert into an app so that it can be used easily by everybody. So I'm going to share my screen now. And I'm hoping that you can see my slide. Is it okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so thank you very much, AMOGS High Risk Pregnancy Committee, the Nagpur Obstetric and Gynecology Society, and Dr. Ketkar Hospital for this opportunity to discuss on a topic which Dr. Kiran said is very important, and that is thrombocytopenia in pregnancy. So you will have a situation where thrombocytopenia pregnancy could be spurious, it could be gestational, it could be ITP, It could be a macroplatelet syndrome. It could be a part of lupus anticoagulant. It could be hypertensive disorders in pregnancy. It could be a dangerous situation of microangiopathy, or it could be even worse, DIC in this patient. So there is a huge maze of causes of thrombocytopenia that we need to negotiate, and there are some crooked and horrible turns that we need to anticipate, pick up, diagnose, assess, and then get on with the therapy to make a correction so that we have a normal pregnancy. Of course, infective causes such as malaria, typhoid, dengue, and now in the COVID era, COVID, are also important causes of thrombocytopenia. But then the topic would be too long. So I've decided not to discuss these infective causes because, as you can see, the incidence is very less. So what are my learning objectives in this webinar? To recognize the common clinical signs and symptoms of thrombocytopenia in pregnancy. Try to understand then the specific causes in pregnancy in terms of thrombocytopenia. And how do I approach this differential diagnosis which is there on your slide? So how do I view thrombocytopenia in pregnancy? Whenever I get and Dr. Gorak said that you should have a complete blood count. That means you should look at hemoglobin, white cells and platelets and look at the indices. After seeing all these aspects, if it's only an isolated low platelet count, I would say that this is thrombocytopenia in pregnancy. So first look at the CBC before you decide further. If the thrombocytopenia is associated with anemia, other than the common causes that were discussed, such as nutritional anemia, thalassemia, or obvious bleeding, then this combination of anemia and thrombocytopenia may be unholy. So start looking for unholy connections. And at this point of time, ask your pathologist to look at the peripheral smear for damage to the red cells. If there are schistocytes or fragmented red cells, we are looking at microangiopathy of hypertensive disorders or TTP-HUS, which could be quite remarkable for the patient's pregnancy. At the same time, I have to tell you that a platelet count which is normal is 150 to 400,000. So any platelet count which is less than 150,000 is considered to be as a thrombocytopenia. You'll notice that in pregnancy, by the end of the pregnancy, about the third trimester, about 6 to 10% of pregnant women all will have a drop in platelets. It may not be technically thrombocytopenia, but all of them would have had a drop in platelets if you were to compare their platelet count at the beginning of the pregnancy. So the drop is common and it is usually gestational. But thankfully, only 1% of pregnant women actually have platelet count less than 100,000. So we are only concerned with those thrombocytopenias which are less than 100,000. So our task in this discussion is to understand the pathophysiological nature of the thrombocytopenia and do a risk assessment for both the mother and the fetus. And on this will be based our treatment goals, because don't forget, the thrombocytopenia is a moving target. So your platelet count of the patient is not going to remain the same throughout pregnancy. It is going to waver either up or down based on how the pregnancy progresses and what's the underlying pathophysiology. And therefore, we should also keep changing our differential diagnosis or the way we approach the patient as the pregnancy proceeds. And especially during delivery, the thrombocytopenia becomes even more significant. Remember, in order to treat the thrombocytopenia in pregnancy, platelet transfusion is not the answer. Understanding the pathophysiology is the answer. Thankfully, from an obstetric point of view, I'll say that 70% of patients who got thrombocytopenia in pregnancy don't need to be addressed too dramatically, because most of them are going to be gestational thrombocytopenia, 70% of the times. As the platelet starts going below 100,000, I'm going to suggest certain tests. Usually, bleeding spontaneously does not occur till it is about 10,000. So between 10,000 and 100,000, numbers such as 50 and 80,000 come into play, because any surgery other than an epidural anesthesia can be done even at a platelet count of 50,000. We've had normal deliveries done at 50,000, and sometimes we've even taken up for cesarean sections under GA with a platelet count less than 50,000. But if you want to use epidural or spinal anesthesia, technically we need 75 to 80,000 platelet count so that we don't develop a hematoma at the site, assuming that the coagulation is normal. So I'm talking of patients who've got thrombocytopenia where the coagulation is normal. What's my basic thinking in thrombocytopenia? I have to decide when the patient comes to me, is it infective or non-infective? Easy, because fever history is there for infective. I then confirm, is it genuinely thrombocytopenia or there is a mistake that the platelets are actually stuck to each other and therefore the machine is giving us the wrong answer. That's called pseudothrombocytopenia. This can be done by taking a sample of CBC in a citrated bulb, which will open up these clots and give us a much better answer. And I think commonly we should think of common things first rather than being esoteric. So most of the time is going to be gestational thrombocytopenia. Instead of panicking and making the patient panic, it is better that we logically approach and see what is common first. So can I give you some definitions? I would say that any platelet count above 50,000 is considered mild, between 10 and 50 moderate, and as it goes below 10, it is severe. This severe thrombocytopenia is also associated with more incidence of spontaneous bleeding rather than the other two categories, which have to have an event to make them bleed, such as a surgical intervention. And therefore, we have to be careful what the platelet count is at that time. So from an obstetric point of view, what can I tell you? So if it's genuine, that is, it's a true thrombocytopenia, most of the time it's going to be gestational. About 20% of the time, there's going to be a hypertensive disorder such as preeclampsia, eclampsia, or the HELLP syndrome. Fortunately, not very commonly, it is going to be immune thrombocytopenic purpura, that is ITP. Even more fortunately, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome is going to be lesser, probably about 1 to 2%. And then there are others which are including such as bone marrow failures, malignancies, PNH, etc. They are not so common. Now, when I spoke about saying that there is something like a pseudothrombocytopenia, this is a neutrophil on which the platelets are stuck. This is called platelet satellitism. Therefore, these platelets don't get counted, and that's why you get a false low value. Or a situation like this where you can see a huge clump of platelets over here, which are all stuck to each other. And when you do it in citrate, you get a much better answer. I have the advantage of looking at smears, which is why every patient who's referred to me, I look at the smear to see that really I'm genuinely dealing with a thrombocytopenia or not. Then taking medical history becomes important. We look at all the past obstetric records, what had happened to her during her previous pregnancies, if she has had a pregnancy before, if she's a known case of ITP, what treatment she took, is there a family history of bleeding? That means, is there a coagulation disorder along with this thrombocytopenia, or she had severe thrombocytopenia and a family member suggesting a severe form of ITP? Does she have autoimmune disorders such as SLE, antiphospholipid antibodies? And then in the physical examination, we look for signs of bleeding or easy bruisability on the patient. We look for fever, we look for organomegaly, and then of course we look for any arthritis as part of autoimmune disease. We all check the blood pressure, and if the blood pressure is up, we know we are dealing with a thrombocytopenia of hypertensive disorders, which we'll soon come to. And unfortunately, if the patient's neurological status is not very good, we might be heading towards a microangiopathy, which might be really dangerous. So from a medical history and physical examination, when the patient appears in front of you in the either in the OPD or on the hospital premises, we can at least get an idea as to what we are dealing with, whether it's a gestational or a non-gestational thrombocytopenia. Is it ITP or not ITP? Are we dealing with hypertensive disorders? The easiest probably is familial macrothrombocytopenia. In Mumbai, we have a lot of patients coming from different parts of the country who come for work or to stay, live over here. And we have seen a lot of familial macrothrombocytopenia in patients coming from Kashmir, especially the Kashmiri Pandits, UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, Paschim Bangla, and the northeastern states. It's sometimes thought to be a genetic disorder, where in those areas, the platelets are large and therefore they're not counted by the machine. And you can see it over here. The size of the platelets is almost half the size of the red cells. The machine will not count these platelets, and therefore by looking at this smear, we know that these patients usually have no bleeding disorders and no bleeding complications, and you can proceed without much therapy. Usually it's ethnic in nature. Like I said, the commonest is gestational thrombocytopenia. Usually it is thought to be dilutional in nature. There is also some data that maybe because of thrombin being generated on the surface of the placenta, there is consumption of these platelets, which is going like a small low-grade DIC. No one's proved that. Usually it is incidental and asymptomatic, and it then becomes a diagnosis of exclusion. We see gestational more commonly during the second and third trimester rather than the first trimester. It rarely goes below 70,000. And fortunately, no treatment is needed because any number which is above 30,000 generally does not require any treatment in terms of platelets. So we tend to observe these patients. Cesarean section is not as per the platelet count, but the obstetric reasons only. Epidural anesthesia is safe as long as the platelet count is more than 80,000. And usually the fetus that is born is unaffected by the thrombocytopenia because the mother doesn't have really an antibody which is causing this platelets to go low. However, knowing this gestational thrombocytopenia is important because it may recur in the next pregnancy. And therefore, having this data is important for her next pregnancy so that we don't do too many investigations. Also, we don't get very anxious or make the patient very anxious because we know it's happened in the past and we know her behavior was fine. Coming to immune thrombocytopenia, its incidence is about 3 to 5%, and ITP can present for the first time in pregnancy, or if it's already a known case of ITP, it can present worsen during ITP, and usually it's seen in the first trimester, unlike gestational, which is seen much later in the second or third trimester. ITPs can also be asymptomatic, or sometimes they can come with purpura, minor bruises, bleeding, or sometimes even bleeding in odd places such as the brain. And intracranial bleed usually in ITP is fatal, rather can be fatal. ITP, unlike gestational, worsens during the gestational progression. And that's why it's a problem to manage patients of ITP going into pregnancy. And we do a lot of counseling for young girls who are known cases of ITP with low platelet count, that they have to be very careful in the decision about wanting to get pregnant. If they do, then we have to treat them, bring their numbers up to a level at which is comfortable for pregnancy to proceed. Many times this low platelet count may not be so low. It might be in the 50, 60, 70 range, like a chronic ITP, and therefore can mimic even gestational thrombocytopenia. And that's why we have to go to history, and therefore it becomes a diagnosis of exclusion. However, be careful. Always check for the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome by lupus anticoagulant, anticardiolipin antibody, and serum beta-2 glycoprotein 1 antibody. Because sometimes the APS itself can be the cause of thrombocytopenia. Don't forget, APS along with thrombocytopenia usually does not bleed but actually clots, and therefore it can cause recurrent pregnancy losses or small for date or prematurity or even IUG or IUFD in our patients. So don't sometimes take this thrombocytopenia too lightly unless you're confident that it indeed is gestational. The treatment of ITP where the platelet count is low, usually our cutoff is 30, but this is a bedside assessment. Sometimes even lesser numbers are compatible, and sometimes at a higher number we have to treat the patient. So it depends upon how the pregnancy is. And really it doesn't matter whether it's a single pregnancy or a twin pregnancy. The treatment of choice then becomes immunoglobulin, although it's very expensive for our country, but it can be used, the immunoglobulins. It can be used once and then it can be reused after between 3 and 6 weeks because that's the life of the immunoglobulin. I would particularly want to avoid steroids because it plays havoc with both the mother and the fetus and creates a lot of problems at the time of delivery, including infective etiologies. However, I would say that platelet transfusion to be given only if bleeding. We should not give it because whatever the patient's platelets are being destroyed, given platelets also will be destroyed, and therefore you are just introducing a biohazard material into the body of your patient with no apparent benefit unless there was active bleeding. The newer drugs which are called TPO mimetics to bring up the platelets such as romiplostim and L-Trombopac have not been approved in pregnancy. Like in gestational, same numbers are there for vaginal delivery and for the cesarean epidural delivery. And again, the intention is only obstetric in terms of delivery. However, the platelet count is dropping below 20,000 or the patient is symptomatic, we'll have no choice but to give either steroids, immunoglobulin, or even platelet transfusion if bleeding. Unlike gestational thrombocytopenia, the fetus can have low platelets, and therefore we always check the fetal platelet count. And if it's low, we give the fetus immunoglobulin therapy to bring up the platelet count. In terms of management, if we have to give drugs, it is going to be prednisolone in this dose or immunoglobulin in this dose. We know that TPO mimetics are not allowed. So azathioprine has been used in pregnancy. I came to know from my rheumatology colleagues, so they use it. Otherwise, the other option is to use rituximab later on in pregnancy, not upfront. And of course, if it's a chronic ITP and you're going to do a cesarean section, I wonder whether our country will benefit out of doing a cesarean splenectomy, where you remove the spleen at the same time. Coming to hypertensive disorders, this is where I think everyone's heart is in their mouth because in 20% of cases, you might have a situation where the thrombocytopenia has an unholy connection, of which about 5 or 8% would be preeclampsia, the rest being eclampsia, HELLP syndrome, and then going into a DIC-like state. So as you all are better at diagnosing preeclampsia than me, but if a systolic BP is more than 140, a diastolic is more than 90, associated with proteinuria of more than 300, especially around 20 weeks of gestation, we know that we are dealing with a hypertensive disorder of pregnancy such as preeclampsia. And sometimes thrombocytopenia is the first manifestation. So I would just tell you all that if you notice thrombocytopenia new in the pregnancy in the second trimester, please give more attention to the blood pressure, because that's a very good clue that maybe she's becoming hypertensive. So awareness is very important, controlling the blood pressure, and then more frequently monitoring the CBC would be important. Usually the time to be aware of this is the second or third trimester. And sometimes these preeclampsias can go to the extended spectrum, that is HELLP syndrome, that is hemolysis with elevated liver enzymes and low platelets. Now, this HELLP syndrome and its partner, acute fatty liver of pregnancy, can also occur postpartum. So we have to be just careful that sometimes the numbers go up postpartum. So before discharging, just take care that the BP is fine. Usually the HELLP syndrome, if it occurs, it usually settles to normal by the 6th day postpartum, but preeclampsia will have to be managed throughout pregnancy appropriately. A fetus which is born to a patient with preeclampsia or hypertensive disorders can have low platelets, and it needs time for it to come up. Rarely do we have to treat it, but immunoglobulin could be one option, or a small dose of steroids. May I suggest that CBC LFT coagulation, which includes PT, PDT, and fibrinogen, and a renal function test, are the 4 tests that will give you company to make a proper assessment of hypertensive disorders in pregnancy which have thrombocytopenia. Now, the moment you start getting a severe form of thrombocytopenia and multi-system organ involvement, we know that our preeclampsia is going to a severe preeclampsia or into an eclampsia, and you have to be very careful. And our situation then, management changes in these situations. So delivery is indicated for all women with severe preeclampsia, which is more than 34 weeks. We may have to give blood components. Cesarean section should be done by obstetric indication. Sometimes we have to be very aggressive in the management of the blood pressure. And we want the patient to be mobile and active because they have a higher incidence of getting thrombosis. And don't give too much fluid because they'll dilute and cause pulmonary edema. Other routine management that is done, that you carry out usually is indicated over here. But the moment the patient attempts to go into HELLP and extend it into DIC, we'll have to use blood components. So we keep a watch on PT, PDT, and fibrinogen, like I said earlier. And if it's dropping, that is the fibrinogen starts dropping, especially below 200 in pregnancy, you know you're worried. And if the PT, PDT starts prolonged, you know that consumption of factors is taking place. It's just a matter of time before the patient will start bleeding. In such a situation, FFP plus minus cryoprecipitate might be the way to go. And if the platelets are also dropping along with this, especially below 50,000 in patients with DIC, you might need to give platelet transfusion to them. But what about patients if they are less than 34 weeks of pregnancy and they have got a preeclampsia or a HELLP syndrome, or even for that matter, AFLP? In that case, we try to stabilize the patient with corticosteroids, take care to improve the fetal lung maturity, take care of the blood pressure and general methods. And then unfortunately, we'll have to think of delivering the patient as soon as possible, but you'll have better judges at this than I am. What I do know is that actually steroids has not been shown to improve the long-term maternal and fetal outcomes, but all of us use it to improve the fetal lung maturity. We will use supportive care with blood components as and when needed based on the coagulation profile or the bleeding status of the patient. But there's no point in giving components just for a mild prolongation, because then we actually adding fuel to the fire. Sometimes we do therapeutic plasma exchange, especially if the platelets are rapidly dropping, there are signs of hemolysis or renal compromise. This could be the formation of what we call as TTP, thrombocytopenic purpura. Here, we do plasmapheresis, stabilize the patient, and then deliver the patient. Cesarean section is the commonest mode of delivery in such patients. So in HELLP syndrome is the same thinking. Usually it occurs in the later part of pregnancy. There's a rise in the LDH and the liver enzymes with a drop in the hemoglobin and drop in platelet counts. And we need to urgently deliver this patient as soon as possible so that the patient does not get seizures or multi-system organ involvement. And we try to give blood components. or bring up the platelets to a level which is more than 50 so that we can have a safe delivery. In acute fatty liver of pregnancy, also it is a rapid onset, usually occurs in the late second or third trimester. The hypoglycemia is the key feature because liver is associated with glycogen. So its liver failure means the sugar levels can drastically drop and the patient becomes drowsy, sweats, and has all features of hypoglycemia, including tremors, and they go into a severe coagulopathy. Remember, unlike the HELP syndrome, in AFLP, the bilirubin is much higher and the enzymes are not as high, which is exactly the opposite with HELP syndrome, where the liver enzymes are high. Therefore, we can differentiate it easily, but AFLP patients tend to bleed and they are very difficult patients to manage. We have to promptly deliver such patients and give them a lot of supportive care to see that they don't have bleeding episodes. Antiphospholipid antibody, SLE patients tend to have it more often in the common community. That is, the incidence of positive APLA is about 2 to 4%, of which 50% might be pathogenic. That is about 1 to 2% actually of antiphospholipid antibody may be pathogenic. Most of the times, 50% of the time, they may not be pathogenic. They might be just as part of age or as part of drugs or as part of recent infections. However, if they are present, then they can create a problem not only of thrombocytopenia, but recurrent thrombosis of the placental and duodenal vessels, causing recurrent pregnancy losses. So early pregnancy losses up to 3 in the first trimester, or a late pregnancy loss with features on the placenta of placental infarcts are really important criteria that the patient might be having underlying antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. And such patients do very well with a combination of aspirin and low molecular weight heparin, and steroids and immunoglobulin generally are not indicated as per the current ESHRE guidelines of 2017. So can I give you my diagnostic approach to patients with thrombocytopenia? Now, this is an etiology-based diagnostic approach. So look at the platelet count. If it is less than 150, look for any medical disorders or drug injections. If there are any, take care of them. Look at history of ITP. If there is, you must send it across to your friendly neighborhood hematologist, who will look at the ITP from its own point of view and see whether it merits treatment or not. However, if there are no medical disorders or drug injection and there is no previous history of ITP, then in that case, I would strongly recommend that you ask your pathologist to look at the smear. If only the platelets are low and the rest of the numbers are fine, you're probably also looking at some medical disorder which you can revisit, or it could be a gestational thrombocytopenia, ITP. However, if the peripheral smear shows that there is a drop in hemoglobin also, and it is not related to iron deficiency, vitamin B12, then it could be hemolysis, that is called microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. This is associated with either TTP in the second trimester, which is dangerous, preeclampsia, eclampsia, and HELP syndrome in the late second trimester or third trimester, or postpartum. If this develops, this could be an atypical HUS, hemolytic uremic syndrome. Therefore, thrombocytopenia etiology-wise can occur at different times. Knowing which occurs at what time also can help you to find out what could be the possible etiology. However, if there are dropping platelets rapidly, rising blood pressure, rising liver enzymes, rising creatinine, and a fetal growth which is getting compromised, you know that this thrombocytopenia is here to create you a problem, and you have to take some quick decisions as to what's to be done in terms of delivery. Can I tell you in terms of platelet count how to go about things? If the platelet count is more than 80 or 100,000, an epidural anesthesia, spinal anesthesia, and cesarean section is fine. If it's somewhere between 50 and 80, we could go in for a vaginal delivery, especially with general anesthesia. But if it is less than 30,000, such patients need to be treated either with steroids, because we are hoping it's gone into third trimester and we are looking at delivery, or immunoglobulin if it's earlier on and they can afford it, and never platelets unless the patient is bleeding. What do we do between 30 and 50,000? It's a bedside decision. Sometimes we use immunoglobulin, sometimes we give steroids, but generally we reassure patients and keep doing their CBCs more often. All this assuming that the coagulation profile is normal and that there is no tendency to bleed in this patient. Can I give you some recommendations in terms of what tests we should perform for patients who have either got a history of thrombocytopenia in the past pregnancy or in the current one? I would say CBC with platelets, because unfortunately in some laboratories, the CBC is not given along with the platelet count. It gets a little bit of a step motherly, a step sisterly, step daughterly, step whatever treatment, and platelets are not included. I would strongly recommend that you must ask for platelet count along with the CBC. Complete blood count, platelets should be included. It's part of the blood count. It's part of the family. A good examination of the smear, checking the creatinine coagulation profile, especially with fibrinogen. People forget to do fibrinogen, it's very important. Doing a liver function test, LDH, looking for an autoimmune disorder, especially like antiphospholipid antibody, and looking at 24 hours urine protein. You'll see from this set, you can pick up anything: gestational, ITP, APS syndrome, and any of the hypertensive disorders in pregnancy. So giving a quick reference to pregnancy thrombocytopenia, if it's spurious, you know you don't have to worry. Gestational, you're going to observe. If it's nutritional, you're going to correct it. If it's ITP, you're going to observe or give immunoglobulin or steroids, as might be. But if it's a microangiopathy like the ones which have been shown here, you have no choice but to deliver, especially if they are compromised or if you're not able to stabilize them for a longer period of time. In TTP, there is some data that you can continue plasmapheresis for 2 or 3 or 5 occasions till we are able to deliver and prolong the pregnancy. On the other hand, if it's a ethnic macrothrombocytopenia or as part of hypersplenism, you can continue observation in such patients. So I'm going to conclude the discussion by saying that thrombocytopenia in pregnancy usually evokes fear in the obstetrician, and it has different reasons and outcomes, and therefore assessment is needed for better care. And we can do this by a good history, physical examination, and blood pressure, along with adequate investigations that we have pointed out already. We should be quite happy that 70% of the time we are not going to have a problem. But if the platelets start dropping below 50,000, then start thinking of another cause like ITP. And if there is other hypertensive reasons, then accordingly we must react. 50,000 is enough for a vaginal delivery, a normal delivery. But if you want to do an epidural LSCS, then it has to be at least 80,000. And the delivery has to be as obstetric indications. The fear of platelets should not be the reason why we should decide which mode of delivery. And also unnecessary platelet transfusion should be avoided, because you don't want the patient to get HIV, hepatitis B, or hepatitis C later, 3, 4, 6 months down the line, and for them to blame you that why did you give me platelets when it was not necessary. We should aim for a safe level of platelet count than a normal platelet count. And I would say anything 80,000, we are safe because we're going to be able to deliver. Look at the whole CBC report, as any other cytopenias might invite a different approach. And finally, a rising blood pressure, altered consciousness, rising bilirubin or creatinine can be a serious cause. Please take it very seriously. So I wish you have a safe pregnancy and delivery. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bhave. That was a very lucid presentation. A few questions to you. First is how to differentiate thrombocytopenia of megaloblastic anemia from the other causes.
Yeah, so I think Dr. Gorakh has already pointed out that we should be doing a vitamin B12 and folate level in these patients. So I have the advantage of looking at the peripheral smears. So what I also see is that the MCV is high. If you've got an MCV which is 120 plus, we know that we are dealing with a megaloblastic anemia, either of folate or B12 deficiency. And let me tell you, in the community, it is B12 deficiency which is more common than folate. To get folate deficiency, you have to have a lot of diarrhea for a prolonged period of time to not be able to absorb folate, because we do get folate from foods and milk. B12 is a problem, and therefore B12 deficiency is much more common. Look at the slide: macrocytes, macroovalocytes, MCV 120, and low platelets. This is more likely going to be a thrombocytopenia, B12 or folate deficiency.
Okay. Well, like coming to B12 deficiency, how do you rate the nasal B12 versus injectable B12?
Yeah, you can use nasal B12, we can use sublingual B12, injectable B12. Yes, they all work. There's no doubt about that. Problem is availability.
Okay. Yes, Gorakh, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I want to ask, sir, collecting the blood sample for the CBC in different bulbs, does it alters the levels of platelets? Because
that's a good question. Yeah. So if you add standard tube is EDTA, and in citrate, when we take it, there is a little bit of 3.5% citrate inside. There's a fluid, so it dilutes the blood. Therefore, we have seen a drop in hemoglobin by almost 0.6 to 1 gram, right? But platelets will not be affected by the citrate. And if there is a pseudothrombocytopenia, the citrate may actually give you a higher platelet count. Because citrate will open up. EDTA causes change in the zeta potential on the surface of the platelets. So they tend to stick to the endothelium. That material of EDTA, that chemical, causes the negative charge to go between cells and cause them to clump to each other, which citrate does not have. So the cells move away and you'll get an accurate value.
Okay. Another question to Dr. Bhave. Is it necessary to irradiate platelets before transfusing?
Oh, okay. Great question. So in routine practice, no, it is not to be irradiated. But if you got a patient who's post-transplant or who's got a T-cell disease or who's got, immune-mediated disease, not ITP, but they're called SCIDs, combined immunodeficiency diseases. Those are candidates for transfusion, for irradiated platelets. Otherwise, no, we don't give platelets. And while we are on the topic of platelets, I might tell you that giving single donor platelet might be better than giving random platelets. Although there's no difference in the kind of benefit you get. My just selfish thinking is that single donor platelet, you're exposed to one donor. When you give 6 random platelets, you're exposed to 6 different people. Now, for the pregnant woman to be exposed to so many HLA antibodies through the platelets, you know that there's no ABO blood group on the platelets, but it expresses HLA and PF, platelet factors. And she can develop an antibody to them, creating problems in the future. So I'm more keen, avoid platelets if necessary, only then. And if you have to give, preferably group specific and preferably single donor platelet, and avoid random. But if nothing is available, you need to use, of course, go ahead for random. Random, any group is fine.
Yes, Dr. Gorakh, you wanted to say something?
Sir, we have suppose screened the patient for hypertensive disease, and now she is at risk for preeclampsia. So
Now she is
at risk for HDP,
Yeah,
hypertension.
okay.
So we want to start her ecosprin. And now our patient is of gestational thrombocytopenia.
Yes.
But she has high risk for HDP as well. And I want to start the ecosprin. So what?
Yeah. So it's a tough situation and it's a great question. But if the platelets are dropping and the patient became hypertensive, I'm now going to cease calling it gestational. I'm going to call it a hypertensive disorder of pregnancy. And I'm worried about that platelet count dropping. I'll look at the smear, confirm that the platelets are indeed low. I'll see the size of the platelets. In your CBC, you get something called as MPV. That is a mean platelet volume. If that is large, you should be assured that it's less likely that the patient will bleed. But they can be sticky. And therefore, I take your point that giving ecosprin might be beneficial to these patients. I have given aspirin with platelet count as less as 50,000, where it is absolutely necessary. If I were to extrapolate this data to, say, PTCA patients who had stents put in, I've gone with aspirin as low as 30,000. Because where it is necessary, the intention is honest. And on paper, if I write down why I'm giving it, I'm justified and I counsel my patients. I think we should go ahead with what we think is right for the patient.
Dr. Bhave, one question. Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Bhave, I'm audible, I believe.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah. What I would like to know is, as the absolute indication, for giving a single donor platelet transfusion. Many a times, it is the anesthetist demand, the madam, the platelet count is 80, 90. I want a single donor platelet in hand before you're doing a cesarean for an obstetric indication in this patient. So what should be the stand? The last 2 lines were very important, aim for a safe platelet level. But then the panic reaction is so high that the anesthetist sometimes refuse without taking the patient with, a single donor platelet.
But then this is why I say thank you to you that you've got the awareness through such meetings that we must tell our colleagues. Yes, anesthetists are little, I don't blame them. They're anxious because they put in the needle, so they are liable.
Yeah.
We might say whatever. It's just that their guidelines also say 75 and 80,000. So I don't think now any anesthetist will ask for a higher platelet count when the platelet count is 75 to 80, especially with the coagulation being normal. So I doubt that's going to happen. If it happens, I would strongly recommend that we show the guidelines to them. There's no harm. I mean, we're all doing everything for the patient. So showing the guideline helps. Despite that, if they want to go ahead with it, then it becomes a very sticky situation we have to talk to them and explain to them that it is not necessary to give platelets. And the absolute indication for giving single donor platelets would be only if the patient is bleeding, whatever will be the platelet count. If they are bleeding, or if the patient has got a platelet count which is less than 30,000 and you need to take up for surgery now. Let me tell you that we've done cesarean sections with platelet counts of even 20 and 25,000 by giving one single donor platelet on table. So at the time of the incision, we've said, okay, you start the single donor, and we've done quite well. Am I recommending that? No, I'm saying that because I'm standing next to the patient. I'm there in the ICU. So, for me, I've seen the smear, I've talked to the family members, I've done everything. So it gives me great confidence. So I'm assuming everyone will develop their own confidence and be able to also do the same thing. So giving platelets is a very bedside decision. We have to document, if you're going to give platelets, why we are giving it, and what can be the consequences. We take a consent from the patient, if not possible, then the family members, that we have to expose her to blood component.
Okay, another theoretical and academic question. You have been reading it. Like, do you subject these patients to any qualitative tests of platelet function? We are just all the time concentrating on the numbers,
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
So I think the only qualitative function of the platelet is a platelet aggregation study, which if you see, is a horrible test to perform. Any laboratory will really cringe when they get a reference for that. Fortunately, in today's world, we've got a machine called the TEG, thromboelastogram, which from its maximum amplitude tells us whether the platelets are functionally active or not. TEG is not a very expensive machine. So in my last discussion, I think it was in Solapur when I was there for the meeting, and also once in Nagpur when I was there for the meeting, I had said, if you've got a few nursing homes close by, you can always buy one machine and keep it in one place, and you can use it to analyze rapidly how the coagulation is. Because I was told that by the time you send a PT, PDT, fibrinogen, the reports come, it takes a long time. But a TEG will give you a value in about 25 to 30 minutes, maximum 40 minutes. And that will tell you which component is deficient and what needs to be given to the patient. This will be good for the anesthetist and for the surgeon also. And therefore, TEG would be the only way to differentiate. Bleeding time is a useless, I'm sorry, it's not a very good test. On my one hand, bleeding time can be normal. On the other hand, it can be abnormal. It just depends upon how deep you use the scalpel and whether you touched a blood vessel, whether you're roughly removing the clot. So bleeding time is very operator dependent. We have to get away from all these things. We have to be machine dependent.
Okay, Gorakh, there is one question for you, and even sir can be a part of this answer. Role of injection Orofer FCM in first trimester, whether is it safe?
Yeah. Till date, there is no data. So FCM injection in first trimester, it is not safe and it is not recommended. Sir, anything you would like to add?
Anything, sir, would you like to comment?
So I've never used it because I don't have data. I've extensively tried to read why we don't use iron in the first trimester.
Actually.
The only reference I've got is that sucrosomal iron has been used orally in the first trimester. And there is data from Italy for the use of sucrosomal iron in the first trimester. Otherwise, generally because of the hyperemesis and because of various other concerns, I'll just tell you that, the erythropoietic activity in the first trimester just settles down a little bit. So you're conserved by not having menses, you're conserving iron, and your erythropoietic activity has come down a bit. So the amount of iron needed for hemoglobin is not very high. So this is the way nature compensates to see that you don't need iron at that phase because you've already stopped your menses. So you're saving a lot of iron over there. So probably first trimester, nature is trying to take care of it. And then when the dilutional part starts occurring and the gestational anemia starts happening, the erythropoietic activity has increased by that time, but it falls short of the plasma volume expansion. That's why you get that anemia. And that's why there you can start giving iron therapy. So second, third trimester, I think everyone is comfortable, but first trimester, no study, no data. I've only read sucrosomal iron.
Right. Even madam, I have tried to read a lot on that. Why iron is not given in first trimester, but could not find any literature.
So I could only find two things. One is hyperemesis, iron worsens it, and number two is there was some data in mice, I think, that it can give rise to teratogenicity in the first trimester. But there's no data beyond the old data. There is nothing much, but I think it's embedded in everyone's mind not to use in the first trimester.
Okay, there's another question, blood transfusion in pregnancy. That is the only statement which has been made. So maybe they want, what are the indications? Is it safe and when to give blood transfusions in pregnancy?
I would like Naresa you to take the question because.
Okay, sure. So as far as anemia in pregnancy is concerned, we know that there are two groups of patients who have anemia in pregnancy. One is those who are normal, or rather 11, 12 hemoglobin, and due to gestation is coming downwards. And the second one is those who have already a low hemoglobin, either by iron deficiency or beta thalassemia or alpha thalassemia trait, and they go lower. Now remember, every woman probably has a drop in hemoglobin by about 1.5 gram during her pregnancy. If you got a better hemoglobin, the drop will not be so much, it will never come to an abhay bhave. But the moment the starting hemoglobin is low, it will come to an abhay bhave because the hemoglobin drop is more and it's more obvious. In such a situation, if there's iron deficiency, we want to give iron therapy to these patients, oral, IV, whatever. If it's beta thalassemia trait and nothing else, then the question comes up what to do over here because there's nothing to replace other than blood. So I look at the hemoglobin and the growth of the fetus. If the hemoglobin is above 8, with the hemoglobin having been normal before, there is no indication for transfusion. So the current indication for transfusion is if the hemoglobin is dropping below 8. Now, what if your patient had a hemoglobin of 9.5 or 10 before pregnancy, and now it is say 7.5? She is absolutely clinically stable. Would you then transfuse? So the guidelines don't help you there. So then you have to go by your individual assessment. I would not give transfusion to a 7.5. I have not given transfusions for 6.5 and 7 because they are smaller girls, their activity is lesser, their fetal growth is good. I've tried to find out other reasons. And lately, if there's no iron deficiency or vitamin deficiency, I've looked for erythropoietin as an injectable source to bring up the hemoglobin, especially for thalassemia traits. Am I recommending this? The answer is no. But am I using this in practice? Answer is yes. Because there are many young couples who come and tell me that we don't want to take blood transfusion. So is there some other way? And provided there's no benzyl alcohol in that erythropoietin injection, we can use erythropoietin to bring it up. Unfortunately, there's no dose or frequency which has been mentioned. And it is even now mentioned that it is controversial to use erythropoietin. But I've got quite a few young girls where I've used erythropoietin to bring up the hemoglobin with the explicit desire of not wanting to give blood. And I've been successful in except one, all of them. Only one needed because her hemoglobin went down to 6 and she was quite breathless. I gave her blood. So we have options. Transfusion is not the only idea. Reassuring, telling them to reduce their activity, giving them adequate rest, looking at other causes of low hemoglobin. Dr. Gorak beautifully mentioned it. Looking at all those things as an opportunity to increase the hemoglobin should be explored before saying, okay, take blood. Because remember, for the blood transfusion, if something goes wrong, either a reaction or an infective episode, they will blame you for it, saying that when you're the doctor, I'm the patient, I don't know, you said blood, I said okay, and now I'm facing this problem. So don't take it lightly. You see that it's explained and you see that it is documented on paper why it's being given with a counter signature. I'm sorry, I'm being very aggressive, but it's needed in today's world because we are doing something out of an honest thinking. Something goes wrong outside our control, we should not be held responsible for it.
Even WHO guidelines, they say that when we think gestation wise, it may be remote from term or near term, when hemoglobin is less than 7, only blood transfusion, then only it is indicated. Otherwise, even WHO guideline also does not.
But suppose you have a patient who has got a cardiac problem, say it's a valve problem, and the hemoglobin is say 8.5 and she is breathless, I would give blood.
Yeah.
So the number doesn't matter to me so much as what the clinical situation and the discussion which takes place.
Yes.
And eliminating the other causes.
That is the end of question answer session. Sadhana ma'am, any other questions?
Are there any more questions?
I would like to ask last question to sir.
Yeah, definitely.
Sir, is there any entity like heparin-induced thrombocytopenia?
Yes. So heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, we don't see it in pregnancy as such because really we are not using unfractionated heparin. It is seen with unfractionated heparin. It's HIT type 1 and HIT type 2, depending upon whether they have been exposed to heparin in the past. In one, it's a faster drop if they've been exposed. In the other, it's a much slower drop. In one, where they've been exposed in the past, it causes HITTS, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia with thrombosis and skin manifestation. So you can get HIT, HIT, HITT, or HITTS. So there are different stages depending upon how severe is that antibody which is developing. And the other milder form is where you're given heparin, maybe first time, platelets drop significantly, but never, usually doesn't go below 100,000. And then you stop the heparin and it goes up in a matter of 4 to 6 days. Usually we don't see it in pregnancy because the low molecular weight heparin which we use in pregnancy has an incidence of HIT of about 0.8 to 2.1%. So it's very low. That's why we don't talk too much about HIT in pregnancy. But that's a good point. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Can I just make a comment about the anemia? I love the way Dr. Gorak, of course, explained everything to us. Can I just also bring out beta thalassemia? Because I think we have to be able to pick up thalassemias in pregnancy. We don't want a major child to be born. And I just feel that if a major child is born, the couple will say that we did not know and the child is born because you have not tested adequately. So I just want to bring this out in the open that please, let's be very proactive. We do so many tests. Consider HB electrophoresis. But having said that, I want you to also pay attention to the timing. If there is an ongoing iron deficiency anemia, there is a possibility that the thalassemia report may come normal because thalassemia is detected, beta thalassemia, by an A2 which is high, 3.5 and above. Sometimes in iron deficiency, that A2 is brought down. So you might get a false normal value. So my recommendation is give 3 to 4 weeks of iron if it's possible, and then do the thalassemia test. Otherwise, they're going to go around with your thalassemia report saying that Dr. Bhave, Dr. Gorak, Dr. Patwardhan has given me a normal report when actually she's thalassemia minor. So I would give some time with iron therapy before doing the thalassemia test. What if I don't have time? Suppose she's in the 12th week, 16th week, and I have to take a decision because it might be a thal major. I'll do the husband's thalassemia test. If the husband is negative for thalassemia as per the indices or by the A2, then in that case, irrespective of what the mother has, it's not going to make a difference. But doing that exercise shows an honesty that we try to prevent thalassemia major in the child. And therefore, if they come to you in time, checking the HB electrophoresis in the absence of iron deficiency or B12 therapy, B12 deficiency, makes a lot of sense and gives you a lot of peace of mind and sleep at night.
Thank you.
Again, here the question is HB electrophoresis or HPLC. What you will recommend?
So, see, in Mumbai, we are used to HPLC.
Yeah.
The high pressure liquid chromatography. I mean, because we not only pick up thal, but we can pick up other hemoglobinopathies, sickle cell, its quantity. We get people coming from Northeast, so hemoglobin E. Then we get combinations, compound heterozygous, sickle with thalassemia. So HPLC makes a huge difference to us. So I would strongly recommend that we do HPLC. It's not a very, and now if you talk to the companies that they'll even set it up for you and they'll do it on reagent rental basis, yes, you've got a good workload. So you don't have to buy the machine.
Thank you, sir.
So beautiful take-home messages, Shivangi.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think you can give the vote of thanks now.
Yes, yes.
Before that, let me thank Dr. Nandita, Dr. Rajendra Singh Pardeshi, Dr. Kiran Kurtakoti sir, Dr. Sujata Dalvi, Dr. Gorak Mandrupar, and Dr. Abhay Bhave. And of course, thanks to you, Shivangi, for always being my master of ceremony and conducting the program so well. So Shivangi, you can give a formal vote of thanks.
Yes, yes. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for making me a part of this wonderful flowing session. I must say the session was just flowing and everybody was putting the inputs. That's what CMEs or webinars should be like that. Saying thank you is a real difficult job, as few words are never enough to thank the members of a teamwork, involved in a teamwork, but I will try. But even more difficult is saying sorry. So I'll first say sorry. I apologize for a few technical glitches in the program, and please pardon me if I have made any lacunae while conducting the program. Thanking President AMOGS, Dr. Nandita ma'am, for being with us in this important event. I thank Vice President AMOGS, Dr. Pardeshi sir, for gracing the occasion and always being so supportive and for giving his valuable time. I thank both the speakers, Dr. Abhay Bhave sir and Dr. Gorakh sir, for putting their valuable inputs to the topic and making the session so lively. Our chairpersons, by adding up their own questions and chairing the session so well, Dr. Sujata ma'am and Dr. Kiran sir, thank you so much. I thank Dr. Vaidehi ma'am, President NOGS, Dr. Rajasi, Secretary NOGS, for being with us in this important webinar. I thank Dr. Ketkar and Ketkar Hospital for being partners to this event. I thank Dr. Sumit and Dr. Kalpana for sparing their time. And a big thanks to our education partners, MCure Pharma, who are always there in the service of females since years and helping us in achieving Anemia Mukt Bharat. A big thanks to the delegates and audience. Audience ke bina ek speaker adhura hai. Thank you so much, audiences, for such a lively interactive session. And once again, thank you, Sadhana ma'am, for making me a part of this important event. Thank you all. One more slide was there. Again, a technical glitch. It was saying that bye-bye, but kabhi alvida na kehna.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And wish you Happy New Year in advance.
Yeah, in advance.
Thank you.
Yeah, everyone. Happy New Year.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bhave sir,
Thank you.
Great.